for Category 8, Finance. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Again, I am Jarl Crocker. I'm Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Community Action Partnership. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started with today's webinar. First of all of you are muted on entry, so if you would like to comment or ask a question, please use the chat function. You'll find that in the upper right-hand corner of your web browser. And also let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, if there are any trouble, if you have any trouble with your audio or otherwise viewing the slides, just send us a quick message and hopefully we can resolve any problems that you have. Also to let you know, this webinar is recorded. The slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to the Partnership's website within the next couple days, so you can access that or send out a link if you have other colleagues who would benefit from this webinar. Again, this is the 8th out of 9 planned webinars in this series. In a couple of weeks, we will be concluding with Category 9 on data analysis, and at the end of the webinar, we'll make sure to show you the exact time and date for the concluding webinar in this series. And we'll also, again, as I mentioned, stop during certain points in the webinar to catch up to see if folks have any questions and to answer any comments that you might have during the webinar. So please feel more than free at any time to enter in your questions into the chat function, and we'll hopefully get those all answered by the end of the webinar. So again, why don't we go ahead and get started today with Category 8 on Finance. So first of all, I want to make sure everybody is aware of the resources that the partnership has to support all of you with the organizational standards. What you see on the screen in front of you is our technical assistance guide for Category 8. We have technical assistance guides both for our nonprofit and our public agencies, so make sure that you're reading the right guide. But this is your one-stop shop for the resources that the partnership has compiled to help make sure you're in compliance with the organizational standards, but also to help build the capacity of our agencies. While we think that these are the first resources that you should turn to as you're getting ready for the second year of compliance with the standards, these technical assistance guides are meant for your use year-round because they have additional resources for you related to each of those categories in the standards. There are links to other guides, other webinars, how-to manuals, and other supporting resources. And in addition, each guide comes with a series of diagnostic questions that your agency can ask to determine not just whether you're in compliance with the organizational standards, but how well your agency is doing when it comes to the various standards and across all of the categories of the organizational standards. So these are really intended as broad capacity-building resources that you can use at any time, not just when you're getting ready to be assessed against these particular standards. Again, these are on the partnership's webpage in our toolkits and resources section. Just let us know, send us an email if you have any trouble accessing these resources, and we'll make sure that you can get a copy of these guides. So let's go ahead and jump into the standards themselves. We are organizing the presentation just a little bit out of order to cover the different types of standards. So we'll begin by looking at standards 8.1 through 8.5, covering the audit. Then we'll look at government requirements that are standards 8.6 and 8.8. Then we'll turn to board oversight, which is 8.7 and 8.9. And finally, we will wrap up with policies and procedures that are standards 8.10 through 8.13. And again, we'll pause after each standard to see if there are any questions or comments from the audience, and we will keep it moving since we have a large number of standards to cover this afternoon and want to make sure we get through all the material and have time to answer all of your questions. So with that, let's start with standards related to the audit, 8.1 through 8.5. Right, for standard 8.1 on the screen, you have the standards both for nonprofit agencies and also for public agencies. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between those as we go through each standard. So for standard 8.1, it reads the organization's annual audit or audited financial statements is completed by a certified public accountant on time in accordance with Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, uniform administration requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements, if applicable, and or state audit threshold requirements. So there's a lot to unpack in that standard. For public agencies, it's relatively similar with the caveat that it reads the department's annual audit is completed through the local government process in accordance with et cetera, et cetera. So again, for public agencies, making sure you're in compliance with your local government process is the main thing with this particular standard. So let's look at some of the guidance on the assessment for 8.1. A couple of things to make sure everybody is aware of. Again, only a licensed CPA can issue an audit. So if you have somebody else doing your audit, you probably would not be in compliance with this particular standard. Also, a review of transactions is not an audit. It needs to be a full audit, and again, conducted by a CPA. Also, community action agencies need a single audit. That's your A133, not just a financial statements audit. So make sure that you're in compliance with that requirement. And also, check for state variance with the federal threshold of $750,000. There are some states that might have a different threshold other than that federal requirement, that you have a A133 audit if you receive more than $750,000. And also check for variance in your state and federal reporting formats. Again, sometimes there are some differences, and auditees must send a summary report to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. That's important for compliance with the standard. If you don't send that report in, you haven't fully completed your audit process and you're not in compliance. And also, the audit submission deadline is 9 months after the end of the fiscal year. So that's the time frame that you have to get that submitted, again, in order to be in compliance. So some suggestions for documentation, certainly the physical or electronic copy of the audit report and related information, again, to demonstrate that that audit has been completed. And again, to make sure that you complete that process, you would want to include an electronic receipt from the Federal Clearinghouse showing the date the audit report was submitted was within that 9-month deadline, or a letter or other correspondence from a state agency acknowledging receipt of the audit and related information within that 9-month deadline, or earlier if you have a different deadline set by your state. So relatively straightforward requirements for documentation here. So let's pause, see if there are any questions that come in on 8.1. And again, if it's taking you a little time to type that in, we can always come back to earlier standards as we go through the series this afternoon. All right, and again, just a reminder, put any questions or comments in that chat function, and we will continue to pause after each standard to see what questions come through and answer them in order. So moving on to standard 8.2, the nonprofit standard reads, all findings from the prior year's annual audit have been assessed by the organization and addressed where the governing board has deemed appropriate. And for public agencies, it simply states that the department follows local government procedures in addressing any audit findings related to CSBG funding. So making sure you're in compliance and familiar with your local government procedures is key for public agencies. So some general guidance on 8.2. Actually, if you could go back a slide. So first of all, make sure that you know whether the audit contained any findings or question costs. Very important to go through that audit with a fine-tooth comb. Also important to ask, were the corrective action plans submitted to the appropriate audit oversight entity? So making sure you're submitting those plans correctly. And then if a corrective action plan was required, was it adequate to solve the identified issues? So obviously you can go ahead and submit that plan, but it's also important to make sure that you resolved any issues that were identified as findings in your audit. And then, of course, the last suggestion, make sure that the finding was actually a legitimate finding. So there are some cases where you may be able to dispute a finding as identified by the auditor. So again, that's why that audit process is so crucially important and why it really needs to be a focus when it comes to compliance with Category 8. So turning to guidance on making sure that you've got the proper documentation. So again, you would need to show you're in compliance, documentation confirming the agency's response to any audit findings, and that would be a physical or electronic copy of the corrective action plans that have been prepared in response to any audit findings. And of course, the second piece of documentation you would need is that the agency has reviewed its correction plan with the board. And that would include highlighted copies of the official minutes of the meeting with the board indicating the response by management to the audit findings and indicating the board's acceptance of its corrective action plan. So again, just something important to underscore, making sure that you take good board minutes. So many of the organizational standards related to the board or the board taking action need to make sure they're reflected in your minutes, so it's really important that those minutes are comprehensive and accurate. So let's wait to see if there are any questions that have come in on that particular standard. All right, so looks like we are not seeing any, so let's proceed to standard 8.3. For nonprofit agencies, the standard simply reads, the organization's auditor presents the audit to the governing board, relatively straightforward, and for public agencies, the department's tripartite board advisory body is notified of the availability of the local government audit. So guidance on assessment, a couple of things to note here. First of all, a presentation to the audit committee does not count as a presentation to the full board. It's certainly okay to present the specific findings to the audit, present the audit to your board committee, and then do a summary for the full board. If your finance committee or similar subcommittee wants to focus in on the audit, but it needs to be submitted to the full board, not just a subset of that board, and the auditor must conduct the presentation. It is okay if that happens in person, via conference call, or over the web. The auditor does not have to be in the room, but you could not satisfy this particular standard with somebody else simply presenting a summary. You need to have the auditor there presenting the results, and ideally it's best practice to make sure you set aside adequate time for the board to follow up with any questions or discussions with the auditor. So we have a question that's come in over chat.
What if there are no findings?
So the question is, what if there are no findings? And so obviously if there are no findings, then you don't have to worry about that previous standard. Very straightforward. All right, so moving on towards documentation for 8.3. Again, documentation evidencing the discussion with auditors actually took place, and that can include the agenda of the governing board with the required item, and again, those minutes from the governing board meeting with highlights of the discussion, again, underlining the importance of keeping good board minutes. And of course, documentation of the content of the discussion you could also include. Most likely, just simply the board minutes would be sufficient, but you could certainly include the content of that discussion, which would include a printed or electronic copy of a PowerPoint or similar type of presentation, or copies or handouts or other presented or printed media presented to the board. But we believe in those cases simply your board minutes documenting that that discussion did take place should be sufficient. All right, so let's wait to see if any additional chat questions came in. And we'll see if any other questions came in. Nope. All right, so let's go on to standard 8.4. For nonprofit agencies, the standard reads, the governing board formally receives and accepts the audit. And for public agencies, the department's tripartite board advisory body is notified of the availability of the audit. So guidance on the assessment, again, all board members must receive the audit, and the board must use a formal motion or similar process to accept the audit. Again, if you have it accepted by a subcommittee, say a finance committee, that would most likely not place you in compliance. It needs to be the full board that formally accepts the audit. And on to guidance on documentation. So board receipt of the audit would include emails with confirmation of the receipt, so perhaps of the board chair, and the board acknowledgement of receipt in the minutes. That's probably the most important point. And again, the board acceptance of the audit, noting that formal motion that the board approves acceptance of the audit included in the board minutes. So relatively straightforward documentation here. But again, just that reminder, a committee, for example, a finance committee alone reviewing and accepting that would most likely not be sufficient. We have a question coming in. Does each member of the board have to receive a copy, or can they review an existing copy or copies? You know, I think, again, this is up to the state office to interpret specifically, but my guess would be that you would need to document that the board had reviewed the audit itself. I think a strict reading would say each board member would not necessarily have to receive a copy, but certainly the board could review the audit copies collectively, but again, that would be up to the state office to determine the exact requirement there. But again, for agencies, it's good practice to make sure that that audit is distributed to all of your board members. It's important that each board member review that audit and be able to ask questions of the auditor when it's presented. Okay, we'll see if there are any other questions. All right, and for standard 8.5, for nonprofits, the organization has solicited bids for its audit within the past 5 years, and this is not applicable to public agencies, so you don't have to worry about this particular standard. We have another question that has come through. Let me, before we proceed, make sure we get to that. Can the auditor review a draft with the board if the board does not meet timely? Yes, the standard does not put a time frame within review, you know, when you need to review the audit. So you could certainly, the board could certainly review that audit several months after the audit had been conducted, but obviously you could not wait until the next year to review those audit findings or the results of the audit, I should say, since findings are technical. But obviously, good practice would be for the board to make sure to review the results of the audit at the next meeting where they could reasonably have the time to again receive the audit itself and review the results. So again, you could certainly wait a board meeting or two after the audit had been conducted, but generally you want to make sure that that gets reviewed as quickly as possible. I know in some instances agencies may have quarterly board meetings, so there might be a case where the audit happens or is completed right before a board meeting. There's not enough time to fully review it, so you might have to wait a full quarter before they review those results, but that should be sufficient to be in compliance with the standard. But again, make sure that you're reviewing your audit results in as timely a manner as possible. All right, so on to the next standard 8.5. Actually, if we can go back a slide really quickly. So again, just to remind everyone, the organization has solicited bids for its audit within the past 5 years. Right. So on to guidance. A couple things to clarify here. Agencies do not have to change auditors every 5 years, so just simply soliciting bids does not mean that you have to switch auditors, although it is suggested practice to change auditors every once in a while because you want that fresh set of eyes on your books and generally get another set of opinions, but it's not a requirement of the standard that you have to change auditors. Informal solicitation of bids does not satisfy the standard, so simply calling up another auditor and asking for a bid would more than likely not qualify to meet this particular standard. It does have to be a formal bid solicitation process. And also, for clarification, soliciting a bid from the current auditor does not satisfy the standard. So it needs to be an open bid. Again, if you don't get any responses, that's perfectly okay. I've heard of some agencies, that are in areas where there are just simply not that many auditors available. But as long as you have gone through that process, you are in compliance with the standard. All right, let's look at documentation. You could provide a copy of the organization's procurement policy, so it's good to go ahead and write into your procurement policy that you solicit bids for an audit every 5 years. You would also want to include a copy of the request for proposals prepared by the agency and then submitted to potential providers of audit services. You could also include responses from the replying CPA firms to the request for proposals, although I don't think that would be absolutely necessary. And you could also potentially include your scoring grid or evaluation sheet by the entity's personnel responsible for the review of the proposals. But again, the minimum documentation you would need here is just simply documentation that you had submitted that audit out for bid to other CPAs or firms. All right, so we'll pause to see if any questions have come in. Right, we have a question. If the auditor changes the managing auditor that the agency reviews every year, does that satisfy the best practice of changing your auditor every once in a while? I've talked to a couple of folks on this, and I think opinions are, generally that gets probably close enough. But again, this is usually advice given to agencies where there just simply aren't a lot of auditors. If you are located in a very rural area, there just might not simply be a lot of CPAs to choose from, or a lot of firms to choose from. So I think in that case, that would probably get at what that advice is trying to suggest you do, which is to get a fresh set of eyes. You want somebody who might have some different opinions, or who might come at the books in a slightly different way. It's just, again, generally a good idea to get some different opinions every once in a while, what that is left up to the judgment of the agency, but that is just what I've heard from CPAs, from folks who do auditing for a living, that it's good to switch it up every once in a while. But I think, again, if you're in a situation where you just simply don't have that many auditors to choose from, another CPA within that firm, would probably get that other set of eyes that would satisfy that best practice. All right, let's move on to the next standard. So we're now talking about standards 8.6 and 8.8, again going slightly out of order. So for standard 8.6, the nonprofit standard, is the IRS Form 990, is completed annually and made available to the governing board for review, and of course that is not applicable to our public agencies. So some general guidance on 8.6. Forms filed by the extended deadline still qualifies timely, so there is an extended deadline to file your 990, so that would still count. And again, review by a board subcommittee does not meet this standard. And so I think that's just a general good rule of thumb for the standards that do require board approval, board action, that you want that to be the full board in almost every case. You could certainly have it initially reviewed by, say, a board subcommittee or a board committee on finance, but you do then want to make sure that the full board does review that. So, so let's go to guidance on documentation, and then we'll take a few questions. So for 8.6, documentation that confirms an agency has prepared the Form 990 would include a physical or electronic copy of that form and a physical or electronic copy of the related state form if there is any, if it's required by your state. Also, documentation that confirms the agency has made the form available for board review. So this is a two-parter. Again, the board agenda and board minutes would be the best way to show that you're in compliance with this particular standard, but certainly your board packet or your email to the board members with the required forms attached would also most likely be ways to show documentation with this particular standard. So let's take a look at some of those questions that have come in. One is a comment we have also heard from some agencies who have said that due to their large size that changing agencies is not feasible, but they do have rotating auditors within the audit firm. So I think that's just another take on the particular challenges. If you're a large agency, you may want to have some familiarity with your agency, especially if you are, have hundreds of employees, dozens of funding streams. So you would want to make sure that you do have some, again, that your auditor does have some familiarity, but just switching auditors within the agency, again, would satisfy that suggested practice if you have somebody else take a look at that. But even in those cases, I want to stress, you would still have to comply with the standard to every 5 years, make sure that you've solicited a bid from other auditors. We also have another question. We've also heard from some agencies who have said that, oh, that looks like it's just a repeat. So again, a couple of caveats there about switching auditors from within the same agency, but again, you need to make sure that you're putting that audit out for bid every 5 years, even if ultimately you stick with the auditor or the agency that you use. I have another question that's come through. Does each board member need to review the audit, or does that mean all board members attending a meeting with the proper quorum present? So a little bit more of a technical question, but I think as long as you've got a quorum, so for some of those standards that require board action or board review, as long as you have a quorum present and the board takes the required action, you should be in compliance. But again, with these kinds of issues, always check with your state office, because they are the ones who ultimately decide about compliance issues and about documentation issues to make sure that you would be in compliance in that particular situation. But again, that's why it's suggested practice to make sure your full board gets all those different pieces of documentation like your 990 and like your audit results. You certainly want to make sure your full board has access to that, even if some board members aren't at the meeting when you do the full review. You should be in compliance, even if you have a couple of board members who aren't present. But again, check with your state office to make sure you're in compliance with those situations. All right, so let's go on to 8.7. Or 8.8, I mean, sorry, we're going slightly out of order, like I said. So for nonprofit agencies, all required filings and payments related to payroll withholdings are completed on time, and again, not applicable to public agencies. So this is one that's a little bit more complicated because it is comprehensive. All of those need to be completed on time. So again, the agency must comply with all state and federal filings and payments, and partial or late filings, even if ultimately completed, do not meet the standard. So this is one that is fairly strict and fairly comprehensive. So general guidance on documentation, you need to look at your payroll tax returns, copies of checks or other documentation showing that the amounts due were actually paid, retirement plan documentations, submittal forms to the retirement plan, flexible health spending or other similar plan documents, and required flexible health spending or other similar plan document submittal forms. So again, this is a bit more of a technical and complicated standard than would appear just given its brevity. So this is one to make sure that your finance staff has fully reviewed and make sure that, that you have all the paperwork to show compliance here. So let's pause, see if there are any questions that have come in. All right, so seeing none, let's continue to standards 8.7 and 8.9, again related to board oversight. So for standard 8.7 for nonprofit agencies, the governing board receives financial reports at each regular meeting that include the following. One, an organization-wide report on revenue and expenditures that compares budget to actual, categorized by program, and secondly, a balance sheet or statement of financial position. So you need both of those. For public agencies, it reads the tripartite board or advisory body receives financial reports at each regular meeting. For those programs, the body advises as allowed by local government procedure. So again, making sure that you are in compliance with local government procedure for standard 8.7 if you are a public agency. So some tips on guidance for the assessment of this standard. Again, the board must receive both the budget versus actuals for revenues and expenditure and the balance sheet or statement of financial position. So you need to have both of those at every board meeting. And the board does not have to receive reports at special meetings. So for example, if you hold a strategic planning retreat or another form of board retreat, you would not need to have both sets of documents presented there, but at every regularly scheduled board meeting, you would have to have both those reports. Also, make-up reports at subsequent board meetings do not meet the standard if one or both of the reports were not presented at a previous meeting. So it's important to make sure that these are kept current because the standard does require you to present those reports at each board meeting. So for guidance on documentation, a board agenda that indicated both of those forms of financial documentation were presented. A board meeting packet with the required reports included as illustration of what you're providing would also be helpful. Again, making sure that you record the presentation in your board meeting minutes, again, to show that this is done at every board meeting. And email to the board members with the required reports attached, or a physical log with board signatures attesting to the fact that they have received the form. So again, this is something that you need to do at every board meeting, so you need to be able to document that those reports have been presented. We have a question that has come in. So the question is, we have a finance committee that receives these reports. Is that acceptable? Again, I would check with your state office, but my guess is that the common reading of this standard is both of those reports need to be presented to the whole board. Now, of course, you could organize a discussion where the finance committee did the deep dive and simply reported out sort of a basic summary to the rest of the board. But I think in most cases, the state office would say that the full board needs to receive each of these reports. We have another question. Having them have to have a physical log with signatures seems to be a bit of over-documentation. So again, this is something that you should make sure you're clarifying with your state office. I certainly think in most cases, simply having it recorded in the board minutes that these had been presented would be sufficient. But again, different agencies might have different procedures. But again, you need to be able to document that these financial reports are presented at every board meeting. So again, you could probably just simply have your board minutes record that they were presented, but again, check with your state office. All right, let's see if there are any other questions. All right, and not seeing any, let's go on to Standard 8.9. So for nonprofit agencies, the standard reads, the governing board annually approves an organization-wide budget. And for public agencies, the tripartite board advisory body has input as allowed by local governmental procedure into the CSBG budget process. So again, this is one that we tend to get some questions from public agencies, since in some cases the tripartite board or advisory body does not have direct decision-making authority on the budget process. But again, as long as you are following local government procedure, you should be in compliance with this particular standard. And again, suggested practice, even if the tripartite board or advisory body or your advisory body only has the ability to make recommendations about your CSBG budget process, we would encourage the tripartite board or advisory body to do so to make sure that the decision makers do at least have their recommendations, even if ultimately there are other decision makers that are deciding on budget allocations. All right, so for guidance on assessment for 8.9, a board review of the budget without formal approval does not meet this standard. So again, it has to have that formal approval, and review of individual program budgets does not meet the standard. You need to review the budget in its entirety. On to guidance on documentation for 8.9, a copy of the approved budget and a copy of the budget presentation from the board meeting, perhaps handouts or a PowerPoint, or also simply a board agenda with minutes of the board meeting showing the approval action as indicated from the board. But again, this is something that requires that board action, and again, making sure that you have accurate and comprehensive board minutes in those cases. Okay, so let's pause to see if any questions have come in. Right, and seeing none, let's go ahead and continue on. So standards related to policies and procedures, those are standards 8.10 through 8.13. So moving on to standard 8.10 for nonprofit agencies, the standard reads, the fiscal policies have been reviewed by staff within the past 2 years, updated as necessary with changes approved by the governing board. So again, this is a multi-part standard requiring a couple of different actions, and again, this is not applicable for public agencies. So turning to guidance on assessment, these are just some of, under the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for federal awards, required written procedures. So good to make sure you're familiar, because these are procedures that are required under the Uniform Administrative Requirements. And so those would be retention requirements for records, procedures related to payments, procedures for determining the allowability of costs, conflict of interest, maintaining property records, procurement of goods and services, travel reimbursement policy, and fringe benefits. So again, good to make sure that you are familiar with those requirements under the Uniform Administrative Requirements. So guidance on assessment for 8.10. In general, in-process reviews of policies should count towards meeting the standards. So if you're being assessed and you're still in process of reviewing your fiscal policies, you should be able to just simply confirm with your state office when that review is completed and be shown to be in compliance with that particular standard. Also, to clarify, a partial review of fiscal policies does not meet the standard. You need to have the entirety of your policies reviewed. Review of policies without board approval of changes does not meet the standard. So again, just a reminder that this is one of those standards that requires multiple action to show you're in compliance. So this is something that might slip through the cracks. So if you've changed fiscal policies, you need to make sure that the board has approved those changes. And then lastly, a review of changes to fiscal policies by a board committee does not meet the standard. So again, there's that rule of thumb that board committees typically, even though they might be able to do the heavy lifting with some of these standards, I think almost all of these standards ultimately require the full board to consider the various changes, the policies, and other documents. So on to guidance with documentation. Documentation of fiscal policies would include a copy of your fiscal policy manual. Documentation that staff reviewed the policies could include minutes from the staff committee charged with reviewing the policy, so you could just simply include the minutes from that meeting. Policies document with suggested changes and red lines throughout, showing that the review took place and showing any changes that were made. Or a policy manual with review date indicated on the document cover. Turning to board approval, documentation showing the board has approved updates could include simply the board agenda and the board minutes. And also, you may also include the board packet with the policies attached, but I think in most cases just simply board minutes indicating that those policies had been reviewed by the board and any changes had been approved should be sufficient to show documentation. Looks like we have some questions that have come in, so let's pause and take a look. It looks like there was someone with some technical difficulty about not seeing the slides. So just a reminder, all slides from this presentation will be made available on the partnership website, and we usually get those up within a couple of days after concluding the webinar, so you can access both the recording and the slides. All right, and we have an additional comment. Why would in process be sufficient? They still haven't met it. That might not be good practice, and they've had the standard for years now. So again, a reminder that ultimately it's up to the state office to set those requirements, but our understanding is in most places when the agency is assessed against the standards, whether it's that particular one or others that might be in process, that most state offices have procedures where an agency, if they are not in compliance but are in process with complying, can just simply show documentation when that process is complete to illustrate that they ultimately are in compliance. So there's some form of a grace period if you're still in process. Now, of course, if the end of your year has completed and you're still in process, that's obviously going to be an issue. But we just think many state offices that we've talked to do have a grace period if the agency is in process on a standard, and again, they simply show, in a few weeks, typically, that process has been completed. But again, different state offices may have different requirements, and it is the state office does have authority in those cases to decide what counts as in compliance or not. So again, it's ultimately up to the state office. We've just simply heard that in a number of cases there is that grace period. If you're still wrapping up, one of these standards that might be in process, that you just simply show that process has been completed, and you simply get changed to in compliance. All right, so standard 811 for nonprofit agencies, a written document, a written procurement policy is in place and has been reviewed by the governing board within the past 5 years. And that is not applicable for public agencies since your parent agency has that procurement policy. So guidance on assessment for 8.11, and again, you should look at the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards that requires the non-federal entity must use its own documented procurement procedures which reflect applicable state, local, and tribal laws and regulations, provided that the procurements conform to applicable federal law and the standards identified in this part. So the uniform requirements contain further minimum requirements of such policy, and these include that non-federal entities must maintain oversight, that contractors perform in accordance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of their contracts or purchase orders, that non-federal entities must maintain written standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest and governing the actions of its employees engaged in the selection, award, and administration of contracts, that non-federal entities' procedures must avoid acquisition of unnecessary or duplicative items. And so, again, it's important to make sure that your procurement policies are in compliance with those uniform administrative requirements. So guidance on assessment for 8.11. Specific minimum requirements of documentation and solicitation are required based on the dollar amount of acquisition, and these tiers are micro purchase or purchases under the size of $3,000 require equitable distribution of purchases among qualified providers. Small purchase acquisition or transitions over $3,000 but less than $150,000 mandate receipt of an appropriate number of rate or price quotations, and items over the $150,000 threshold can be acquired through sealed bids, competitive proposals, or non-competitive proposals. So again, this is making sure that you're within those federal requirements for your procurement policies. So guidance on the assessment for 8.11. Again, there's a suggestion that in-process reviews should count towards meeting the standard, but again, make sure that you check with your state office to make sure that you can follow up, say you're assessed against the standards, you're still doing that review of your procurement policies. Make sure that, that you can just simply submit the completed review of that to show you're in compliance. Next, the procurement policy should meet both federal and state requirements. So again, make sure that you are in compliance with both those federal and state requirements. Also, a review of changes by a board committee does not meet this standard. Again, you need to have the full board approval, and incorporation of a procurement policy into a fiscal policies manual does not meet the standard. So you need to have that separate procurement policy spelled out. So guidance on documentation for 8.11. Documentation of the procurement policy would obviously be a copy of that procurement policy, and documentation that the board has reviewed changes to the procurement policy would be that board agenda along with minutes indicating that the board had reviewed those changes, and you could also include a board packet with the procurement policy attached, but we believe in most cases simply that board agenda and board minutes should suffice to show compliance. All right, let's stop and see if any questions have come in. All right, it looks like we haven't We're still waiting, but it looks like we don't have any questions, so let's go on to standard 8.2. For nonprofits, the standard reads, the organization documents how it allocates shared costs through an indirect cost rate or through a written cost allocation plan. And again, that is not applicable for our public agencies. So for guidance on assessment of 8.12, organizations have three options for handling these indirect costs, and I won't read all of the fine print, but basically your three options are cost allocation, de minimis indirect rates, and an indirect cost rate. These are gone into more detail in that technical assistance guide that I showed you, but these are basically the three options that you have. And for guidance on documentation, or guidance on assessment, again, in-process negotiations with the federal cognizant agency responsible for the indirect rate approval should meet the standard, but again, check with your state office. If you don't have that indirect cost rate approved when you're being assessed, you need to make sure it's okay to follow up with them when that process is complete to make sure to show you're in compliance. Agencies must also have the final letter of approval for their indirect cost rate from the cognizant agency to comply with the standard. So again, you have to have that documentation in the form of that final letter of approval. And if the agency uses a cost allocation plan, whether the plan must be approved. So again, guidance on guidance on documentation. If a negotiated federal cost rate is selected, the entity should have an approval letter from the cognizant agency responsible to negotiate the rate with the entity. If the cost allocation is used, the entity should have an updated cost allocation policy document laying out the methodology used for accounting for indirect costs. And if the entity is using the de minimis indirect cost rate, this should be indicated on the grant forms received from the funding agency. So again, these are a little bit more technical depending on which option you use. So more guidance is provided in that technical assistance guide. So we also have a couple questions about why the procurement policy has to be separate from the fiscal policies manual. And again, just going back, I think that might be a case where the slides need to be updated. I think it's good to at least have that, the procurement policy as a distinct part of your fiscal policy manual. But again, check with your state office again on this particular issue if you have any particular questions. All right, so moving on to standard 8.13. For nonprofit agencies, the organization has a written policy in place for record retention and destruction. And for public agencies, it reads, the department follows local government policies for document retention and destruction. So you just simply have to follow your local government procedures for that. Guidance on the assessment for 8.13. The IRS Form 990 asks, did the organization have a written document retention and destruction policy? So that is also under your Form 990. And federal grants require that supporting information on the grant, including the financial detail, be maintained for 3 years from the submission date of the final report of the grant. So it's important you're in compliance with your federal grant when you have your retention and destruction policy. So again, good guidance to make sure that you are in compliance with those federal requirements. For the assessment of 8.13, again, check to make sure that in-process reviews will count towards meeting the standard, or that you can at least show that has been completed if you were in process when you were assessed. Also, the policy needs to cover both paper and electronic forms of records to meet the standard, and I think obviously you would need to have, since you have both paper and electronic forms, make sure that you address both of those types in your policy. And the policy must specify the method of record destruction. I think that's a best practice, but again, making sure that you have that specified in there to make sure that it's clear that you also cover document destruction as well. Guidance on documentation would be simply the documentation required to show that you're in compliance is your written policy on record retention and destruction. So again, relatively straightforward to show that you're in compliance with 8.13, but again, make sure you're in compliance with those federal requirements as well about document retention and destruction. So that brings us to the end of Category 8. And so if anyone has any additional questions, you can simply submit them to me directly at jcrocker@communityactionpartnership.com. We'll end with my email address in a second, but also a reminder that our webinar on Category 9 is scheduled for August 21st. That is 2 weeks from today at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and obviously the other times if you are in other time zones. And here is that contact information. I know we had a couple of more technical questions around the fiscal policies and procedures. So if you'd like me to follow up with you offline, just shoot me a question and I can get some additional clarification, because I think some of those might be best practices, but again, we can clarify and follow up offline. So feel more than free to submit your questions directly to me if there are additional issues to clarify, but otherwise, thank you very much for attending this afternoon's webinar, and again, join us in 2 weeks for our last webinar in the series, and we hope to see all of you at the Partnership's annual convention in Philadelphia at the end of the month. So thank you all very much, and I will talk to you all in a couple of weeks.